Alright, so detail part 5. Looking a little bit at the ecological approach itself, the science, and I'll talk about it some, a little intro, give you a start, talk about some of its concepts, but to learn more, of course, we should read J.J. Gibson himself. Read some of the works of scientists working in this area today. Like there's others. Just the one I'm more familiar with right now is Dr. Rob Gray at Arizona State. He's, from what I understand so far, from what I know, what I've heard, well known to have a good understanding of the ecological approach. As maybe I've said already, I've been recording some of these videos for a few days, so I don't remember everything. And this is not a lecture series, this is not a polished lecture, this is a discussion. So, kind of some notes, some discussion of this stuff. But some stuff we need to repeat anyway. Hearing something more than once, hearing something only once, doesn't really help us learn. Repeating something a number of times is important for making sure we get it, for making sure we caught it, for understanding it, for helping us get it in our memories. So some stuff might seem repetitive, but it's good, very important. You'll look at some people who are well known to be really good lecturers or presenters, like Steve Jobs, whatever you may think. He's known for being a good presenter, and he knew that you should repeat things a number of times sometimes. So maybe I'm repeating, but Dr. Rob Gray, he's written a number of books. He's a podcast. He helps major professional sports teams with their coaching and learning and practices, and so on and so forth. Other people out there do also. So he's just the one I'm familiar with now from his podcast and his books. But some Gibson. Let's look at what he says himself and maybe discuss a little bit and then get into, after this part, get into a few more things about videos, like talk about applying this to training a little bit and coaching and practicing and finish that. But we're talking about the science now, but we've already done some of what we've done is discuss the ecological approach to perception, to movement. It's much deeper and broader than just some superficial approach to training. So we've already learned a lot about it, about the ecological approach. And then we'll see some more specific technical stuff that Gibson wrote and that others out there study as well, like Turvey, T-U-V-E-Y, if I remember correctly. But as I say, I'll put links in the description field to things you could look up, follow up on, all that. So Gibson, let's see what he says about some of this. Let me look at my notes here. That's not the browser I need. I'd like this one. And let's see what he says. I have a few tabs here that we'll discuss, but we'll go with this one first. So here, we can learn about what the ecological approach is and how it differs and contrasts from other approaches to learning, things that are philosophically different, majorly different, not minor differences, major ones. Like I say, go into the fundamental root of human nature and how we know the world. You got Plato, Immanuel Kant, Descartes, B.F. Skinner. They are very different fundamentally than Gibson. And we, as I say, we've dug into that a good deal already. We already have a good grasp of the ecological approach, its founding, the foundations, philosophic, the basic, the place it comes from in reality, our knowledge of reality, and then how we put it into practice. Okay, I see here, I'm looking at some stuff I'm about to read, and it's Turvey, not Turvey. Turvey, Michael Turvey. Okay. Let's make that correction while I'm remembering. But we'll get into the science now. Some of it, as I say, we've already discussed some. But here is the ecological approach to visual perception. This is Gibson himself discussing, as I say, his approach, other people's approach, what this means. Now notice in some of this, some stuff I'm going to point out now, and it'll come up again, but he's a scientist here. Some things he says, these are new concepts, we need to investigate them. Or, this is my hypothesis now, it's implicit. He might not say explicitly, this is my hypothesis, we need to investigate this, but he knows in some ways he's onto the right thing, now he just needs to develop it. Just as Galileo was not wrong, he made some mistakes. If you read his Two New Sciences, or read some other of his works, but Two New Sciences is good. It's accessible to most people. There's some math in it, of course, and some physics, but it's a lot of good writing, and you can understand a lot of what's going on and see how he did things. But he started applying Aristotle's epistemology to physics, and then Newton expanded on it, similar here. Gibson's on the right track, period, end of story, no doubt about that. Now we just need to develop this theory, see what's right, what's wrong, what concepts Gibson had that are legit, which ones, and then he's developed really well, which ones need to be refined, redefined, which ones are not useful or wrong, and so on and so forth. No one's omniscient. Everyone makes mistakes. And it seems like Gibson was aware of that. He was a scientist, not the leader of a cult or something like that. So, keeping stuff like that in mind. And again, when you're talking to people about it too, we're talking about science and knowledge. Reality is a certain way, and then figuring out what it's like is entirely different. We have no guarantee that we'll be correct. We can be, obviously we are. We wouldn't know sometimes that we're wrong if we didn't know what was right. We couldn't figure out what truth was, and that there's falsity unless we knew that some things were true in the first place. But in Gibson's introduction to his great work, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, so this is visual, not just all perception. Since visual is so important in what most all of us do, maybe that's what, and there's so much more going on, maybe that's why he focused on this, instead of touch perception or sound perception. But he says in the introduction, this is a book about how we see. How do we see the environment around us? How do we see its surfaces, their layout, and their colors and textures? How do we see where we are in the environment? Unquote. Remember, don't just think inanimate stuff, environment. For humans, that includes human beings. And for dogs also. Dogs, in their environment, it includes humans. So have a proper concept of environment, not something some picture we might see in some book when we're learning some biology or something, but our concept of an environment needs to be developed from real things in reality that we experience. We need to abstract away from certain things to get the concept of environment. Okay, so to continue, really quickly, to not continue yet, for environment, it could be like, how do we see where we are in the environment? Is it an environment of war where you're in battle? Is it an environment of tennis where you're on the tennis court? Is it an environment of football, real football? Or is it an environment of American football, or of doing natural movement, through the forest, or natural movement indoors? We're doing parkour, When people do parkour, they have to see and experience their environment. So, quote, how do we see whether or not we are moving, and if we are, where we are going? Unquote. Because if you just take a visual field and think about things, one object, and drop context, are you moving? Is the other thing moving? Or are both moving? And that's a critical idea. I want to pause on that, because that's one thing that Copernicus identified and then Galileo identified to help people grasp that the Earth goes around the sun. People thought the sun's going around the Earth. We see it moving, but that's not putting things in the broader context of motion. When we see it, when you're on a horse a long time ago riding along, or if someone else is on a horse, or if two people are on boats going past each other, they didn't think of the Earth and the sun as being in the same kind of thing as those. That's again forming concepts. What's alike and what's different? The Earth and the sun moving, and us being on the Earth, us on the Earth traveling with respect to the sun, is like these other things. Us on a horse, two people on boats. Which one's moving? Am I on the Earth still, and in this context, something else is moving and I'm not? Or am I moving and something else isn't? Or are we both? So, how do we see whether or not we are moving, and if we are, where are we going? Quote, how do we see what things are good for? How do we see how to do things, to thread a needle or drive an automobile? Why do things look as they do? Unquote. So here he's starting out his presentation of his approach to visual perception. He says, quote, this book is a sequel to The Perception of the Visual World, which came out in 1950. It is rather different, however, because my explanation of vision was then based on the retinal image, whereas it is now based on what I call the ambient optic array. I now believe we must take an ecological approach to the problems of perception, unquote. So part of the deal is here, you'll see some people think, and again, there's more going on than what we grasp. We got more to learn, you, I, everybody. We all have stuff to learn. There's known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns. There's a hell ton. That's one thing that makes life so awesome and exciting. We got stuff to learn. But some people, they think we don't have direct awareness of reality. What we know is our retinal image. There's the world, there's an image on us, and we're like we're like a little thing watching something on the movie screen. Or they can think that here's the real thing, here's the retinal image, here's you experiencing it, And they think that a retinal image comes in and some like calculus, physics processing thing gets this because it's distorted, Plato's idea. The evidence of the senses can't be trusted. It doesn't really tell us truth. We can't get truth from it. This thing supposedly gets this and makes it like this here. Well, how the hell does it know? Without an awareness of reality, how does this thing know what the one should be like? But that's what some people believe. That is the idea you will find in some modern scientific practice of sports practice, sports coaching, and stuff like that. It's not, so this is not something like, oh, we've always been doing this, or, oh, I already know this. No. It's something I've got to dig into more also. And I look forward to it. It's cool. As I say, it's good to learn, be better, learn more, be more consistent, know how to do things better, know how to help other people better, how to teach and coach and train. So, okay. So, to start again, quote, we are told that vision depends on the eye, which is connected to the brain. I shall suggest that natural vision depends on the eyes and the head on a body supported by the ground, the brain being only the central organ of a complete visual system. So, unquote, so, it's not like the brain is something detached from the world processing on its own, like in some kind of Platonic or Cartesian way. It's part of a whole animal in an environment. That's kind of what he's saying. Quote, when no constraints are put on the visual system, we look around, walk up to something interesting and move around it so as to see it from all sides and go from one vista to another. That is natural vision, and that is what this book is about. The textbooks and handbooks assume that vision is simplest when the eye is held still, as a camera has to be, so that a picture is formed that can be transmitted to the brain. Vision is studied by first requiring the subject to fixate a point and then exposing momentarily a stimulus or a pattern of stimuli around the fixation point. I call this snapshot vision. If the exposure period is made longer, the eye will scan the pattern to which it is exposed, fixating the parts in succession unless the subject is prohibited from doing so. I call this aperture vision. For it is a little like looking at the environment through a knothole in a fence. The investigator assumes that each fixation of the eye is analogous to an exposure of the film in a camera, so that what the brain gets is something like a sequence of snapshots, unquote. And remember, he's talking about textbooks and handbooks and scientists. Real, legit, in reality. That's what some people believed and believe, and how they go about their practice. That's what some people are passing down to us as the implicit philosophy and view of the world about what's going on. That stuff informs how they do science, how they speak, how they think about the world, how they're thinking about you. Quote, the headrest of the laboratory prevents the observer from turning his head and looking around, which provides what I will call ambient vision. It also, of course, prevents him from getting up and walking around, which provides ambulatory vision, unquote. Of course, ambulatory, you might think of the word ambulance, but it means walking around. Ambulatory vision is the vision an animal has in nature, in the natural world. We naturally move. And, ambient would be being able to look around and see your environment. Ambient, meaning ambient is like the surroundings. The ambient temperature is like the surrounding temperature. Okay, quote, are these forms of vision? I suggest they are. In fact, they are the kind of vision we need in life, not just pictorial depth perception. We need unquote. Remember, we're animals. We're living organisms. We're not machines. We're not Cartesian. We're not Platonic. Okay, quote, we need to see all the way around at a given point of observation and to take different points of observation. The crux of the matter is whether or not natural vision is compounded of units like the snapshot. I very much doubt that vision is simplest when the experimenter tries to make the eye work as if it were a photographic camera, even the kind that takes pictures in rapid succession. Looking around and getting around do not fit into the standard idea of what visual perception is, unquote. So, again, the standard idea, even with us today, there's an idea of what visual perception is, and that does not allow for looking around or getting around. Quote, but note that if an animal has eyes at all, it swivels its head around and it goes from place to place. The single frozen field of view provides only impoverished information about the world, unquote. So if we study only the frozen field of view, we're not seeing what kind of information we actually get as animals in reality in the world, or in doing BJJ, or in some sport. If someone's idea is that's what vision is, they're not going to be really telling us what we need to know, what's actually happening. Their coaching is going to be impoverished. Okay? Quote, the visual system did not evolve for this, for the frozen field of view. The evidence suggests that visual awareness is in fact panoramic and does in fact persist during long acts of locomotion, unquote. And that's something we could look into, check your facts, do science, ask questions, okay? Gibson, you're making that claim, back it up. What are the facts? What's the scientific evidence? What's the evidence in reality? Where could I observe that on my own? Where's stuff I could see in experience that you're using to do your science? Because we both have access to the world, as Aristotle pointed out. For Plato, only some philosopher king scientist would know the truth, and the rest of us would be wrapped up in experience full of distortions and lies and couldn't know what they do. But as Aristotle pointed out, every human being, as long as we're in our right mind, not like drunk or something crazy or whatever, but every human being has access to reality via perception. And then what we do with that, we can be right or wrong, because the conceptual aspect of our consciousness is volitional. We have free will in that respect, not perceptually, but conceptually. But we have to see what the evidence is and what the reasoning is and what the science is. I was going to say more about that, but I just forgot. I got so interested and invested in some of that I was saying, and as we do, sometimes we forget. But, oh well, welcome to being human, or as I say a lot, I don't make the rules, I just live here. Cool. So, quote, part 1 of this book is about the environment to be perceived. Part 2 is about the information for perception. Part 3 is about the activity of perception. Finally, part 4 is about pictures and the special kinds of awareness that go with looking at them. Picture vision comes last because it can be understood only after we are clear about ambient vision and ambulatory vision, unquote. So notice that some people might have it backwards. They get picture vision and try to understand ambulatory from that. In other words, they get these fake ideas about trying to treat the eye and human perception and awareness as something it's not, and then try to understand what it is. That's not the way we need to do it. Look at how vision works as an animal moving through the world, as a wasp flying around through the forest, as a hawk, like a Cooper's hawk, flying through the canopy of a tree after some, let's say, hermit thrush or something. That's the kind of vision and perception that really occurs. Or think about a beautiful bobcat one of those sacred animals. I love them. A bobcat chasing after a rabbit through a forest. That's real vision. And then we can understand why we perceive pictures as we do only when we understand that. Pictures are artificial. Looking at pictures is artificial in some respects. Of course, we actually look at them, that's real, but our visual system isn't made to look at pictures. Okay, part 1, 2, 3, 4. So, quote, first, the environment must be described, since what there is to be perceived has to be stipulated before one can even talk about perceiving it. This is not the world of physics, but the world at the level of ecology. Second, the information available for perception in an illuminated medium must be described. This is not just the light for stimulating receptors, but the information in the light that can activate the system. Unquote. Notice information. The information in the light that makes us aware, not just the pure physics itself. That's what he's talking about. Quote, ecological optics is required instead of classical optics. Third, and only here do we come to what is called psychology proper, the process of perception must be described. This is not the processing of sensory inputs, however, but the extracting of invariants from the stimulus flux. The old idea that sensory inputs are converted into perceptions by operations of the mind is rejected. A radically new way of thinking about perception is proposed, unquote. And so here, that's referring to Kant, which he will identify explicitly in a little bit. So again, there's a lot more going out there than we always know. Kant was very influential on modern science and the world, unfortunately. He was one of the philosophic founders and fathers, one of the ones who laid the philosophic groundwork for communism, Nazism, fascism, and other things nowadays, for a lot of misconceptions of how science is done. He laid the ideas that led to some bad ideas about what art is. And notice here he says, just like from the quote by Atlenaes, or however you pronounce it, Atlenaes, something like that. I don't think I spelled the first name right. But as he said, Galileo engaged in a radical renewal of science, of how it's done. It's similar here. That's how to think about this. Where Gibson's going down to the root and getting to direct perception, just as Galileo did, as I've said before. And he identifies right there himself. Quote, the ecological approach to perception was adopted in my book, The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, which came out in 1966. Actually, it is a new approach to the whole field of psychology, unquote. So it's an approach not just to perception, but to psychology. So I'll read that again and then continue the sentence. Quote, actually, it is a new approach to the whole field of psychology, for it involves rejecting the stimulus response formula, unquote. Remember, that's B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner looked at animals as not being conscious, as like machines. So he had a lot of horrible ideas. He did have some good ideas about how to experiment and stuff like that. So if you get some of what he did and put it in a rational context, it's helpful and good. But his context, his philosophical views were very wrong. He would deny we had free will. And he thought, from what I remember correctly, we have to verify this and look into it, but the way Skinner was, he'd be an advocate of a totalitarian government where we should be stimulus responded to do right, because we were just kind of machines to be steered. Okay, so quote, this notion, stimulus response, borrowed from the so-called hard science of physiology, helped to get rid of the doctrine of the soul in psychology, but it never really worked. Neither mentalism on the one hand, nor conditioned response behaviorism on the other is good enough. What psychology needs is the kind of thinking that is beginning to be attempted in what is loosely called systems theory. Environmentalism is a powerful movement nowadays, but in psychology it has generated more enthusiasm than discipline. There is no central core of theoretical concepts on which to base it. The right conceptual level has not yet been found. This book makes an effort to find the right level. A few psychologists, such as E. Brunswick and R.G. Baker, have moved in this direction, but none has ended with the sort of theory being put forward here. The great virtue of the headrest, the bite board, the exposure device, the tachistoscope, the darkroom with its points of light, and the laboratory with its carefully drawn pictorial stimuli was that they made it possible to study vision experimentally, unquote. So notice he's pointing out some good to them. Hey, we can do something experimentally. Sweet, we've made some progress. If only we can put it in a good philosophic and scientific context. Quote, the only way to be sure an observer sees what he says he does is to set up an experimental situation and check him out. Experimental verification can be trusted. These controls, however, made it seem as if snapshot vision and aperture vision were the whole of it, or at least the only vision that could be studied. But, on the contrary, natural vision can be studied experimentally. The experiments to be reported in part 3 on perception involve the providing of optical information instead of the imposing of optical stimulation. It is not true that the laboratory can never be like life. The laboratory must be like life, unquote. So, notice again this whole different perspective. Instead of providing optical stimulation and thinking about the physics to see what we do, Gibson's saying we need to provide optical information. What information is there in the environment that we use, that animals use? Cheetahs, hawks, wasps, bobcats, killer whales. You know, what do things use to move through their environment? What's the optical information? Or information in general. Remember, this is about vision, but you got different forms of perception. Hearing, the haptic, you know, the feel. So what about when you're balancing on a branch? Let's say you got some piece of wood, some branch supported by two things. You got two supports. Let's say you're out in the wild, you got some rocks or something, then you got a branch across it and you walk on that. What's the information there? You know, it's not just the physics involved, but what's the information that allows an animal to walk on it? What about something crossing the creek? A raccoon, an opossum, a mouse, a snake crawling across, you know? What's the information, the sensory information they're gathering? That's what we want to look for, not just the physics, not just, okay, hey, what's the moment of inertia of the branch? What are its torque characteristics and stuff like that? How is it being pulled down to the center of the earth? No, what's the information for the animal in the environment? So again, it's not just doing it yourself, figuring things out on yourself. this is a rich theory and there's a hell ton to it. Okay, so quote, it has to be admitted that the controlled displaying of information is vastly more difficult than the controlled applying of stimulation, unquote. So again, information versus stimulation. To display information that an animal needs to move to achieve a goal is different than just some stimulation. Quote, experimenters are just beginning to learn how to display information in a few scattered laboratories at Cornell, Uppsala, the University of Connecticut, and Edinburgh, unquote. Remember, this is like, I don't know when he wrote this. Is that up here? Scroll back up. Should be at the beginning of the book. Copyright 1986. Okay. So, more recent than I maybe would have thought. I was thinking it was in the 70s or something, but you could tell. A book in the 50s, a book in 66, this book in 86. So still we got this book when it was published it was about 40 years ago. So remember, that's the context he's speaking in. It's not our current 2025. Quote, the experiments I will report in part 3 are mostly my own, and the evidence therefore is scanty. Other students of information-based perception are at work, but the facts have not yet been accumulated. The vast quantity of experimental research in the textbooks and handbooks is concerned with snapshot vision, fixed eye vision, or aperture vision, and it is not relevant. I do assure my readers that I know this body of research. I have even contributed to it, but they will have to take my word for it, unquote. Or they could look it up and see what he's done. You know, what's his research in that area. We could do someone could write a book about it, about Gibson's, do a biography, and then we'd know. We could look on Google Scholar and so on. Okay, so again, as I said, he's a scientist. He says we're researching things, we're figuring things out. We're not omniscient, we're not Platonic philosopher kings. He knows, as Galileo knew, that all human reasoning must be placed second to direct experience. Unlike Descartes, we don't make up an idea in our head and hold on to it and believe it's true and then just dismiss experience because experience is full of lies and distortions. You know, that'd be an implication of what Descartes and Plato thought. You say like that contradicts what I say. Ha! You're full of distortions and lies. You know what you're talking about. It's like, I got my theory. I'm a philosopher king. I know what I'm talking about. And your experience can't like overturn my theory. No, because I'm a philosopher king. You know, that's loony. So notice that Gibson's not like that at all. He's focused on experience, as we should be, because he wants direct perception of reality. And he wants his science to be based on direct perception of reality. But then we'd have to investigate it, because we're all influenced, unfortunately, by some Platonic thinking. It was in our education, it's in the culture, it can slip into us, you know, accidentally, or it was trained into us some in our upbringing and education. So we got to be on the alert for it, and help each other out with it. You know, so it's good that if you got good friends that support you, but then tell you when you're wrong in a good constructive criticism way, you know, then you can get rid of some of that Platonic stuff. But Gibson's being scientific, that's good, being more Aristotelian in that respect. Quote, I am also asking the reader to suppose that the concept of space has nothing to do with perception. Geometrical space is a pure abstraction, unquote. Remember abstractions from Stephen Jay Gould, and you know, or from Aristotle. So we got to make sure that our abstractions are not Platonic, but are instead Aristotelian. Make sure our abstractions are rooted in experience and come from them. So geometry isn't invalid. in a Platonic sense. We can get geometry, geometrical space by valid abstraction. But, quote, outer space can be visualized but cannot be seen. The cues for depth refer only to paintings, nothing more. The visual third dimension is a misapplication of Descartes' notion of three axes for a coordinate system. The doctrine that we could not perceive the world around us unless we already had the concept of space is nonsense. It is quite the other way around. We could not conceive of empty space unless we could see the ground under our feet and the sky above, unquote. So we can't have empty space, some pure Cartesian coordinates with nothing in it. That comes later. It is much more abstract. No young child ever can get that. That's something we learn way later in life. Okay, first we see the ground under our feet and the sky above. We're in reality. And through forming many, many concepts and generalizations, then eventually we can get to the point where we have the cognitive material to form the concept of empty space. That's what he's saying. Whereas Kant says empty space comes first. That's why Gibson has that first sentence in here. I'll read that again. Quote, the doctrine that we cannot perceive the world around us, the sky, the earth, and things in it, unless we already had the concept of space, is nonsense, unquote. Okay? So, quote, well, first of all, that was like, he's referring to Kant there, which we'll identify specifically in a minute. But, quote, space is a myth, a ghost, a fiction for geometers. All that sounds very strange, no doubt, but I urge the reader to entertain the hypothesis. For if you agree to abandon the dogma that, quote, percepts without concepts are blind, unquote, as Kant put it, a deep theoretical mess, a genuine quagmire will dry up. This is one of the main themes of the chapters that follow, unquote. Okay, so there's an idea that a lot of people accept. So again, the ecological approach is not just something that we all knew or we've all been doing. No. People have this faulty view of space and a faulty view of how we abstract, and that's what's going on here. So what Gibson's saying is that we should not, he's talking about how we form concepts too. What our nature is, how we form concepts. We should not think that we have some abstract idea first and then we get specific things. He's saying, get rid of that. It might sound strange to do what you're different, to think about the evidence of the senses and awareness first, but that's only because we've been trained and we've had, in part in our education, these Platonic influences. Our education is not entirely Aristotelian. That's kind of what he's saying there. He's saying these ideas that, or these methods of thought that you've trained in yourself through years of education, and in our education, some things have been good and some have not. But the things in us that are the methods that are Plato or Kant, it's Plato and Kant reaching out to us from thousands or hundreds of years ago. Thousands in the case of Plato, hundreds in the case of Immanuel Kant. They're reaching out and affecting our education and affecting how we think. And that's what Gibson is referring to. He's saying, hey, it might seem strange from how you're trained to think about science and how to use reason, but let's please put perception first. Let's put all human reasoning second to direct experience. Let's be like Galileo and Newton, but be like them in psychology and the theory of perception and movement, not just in physics. There's a little more in the introduction, but that helps us see what the ecological approach is about and how it's different than other approaches and how they are actually out there. We get this more fundamental view of it. What in reality are we referring to? If I just jumped in and talked about invariants and affordances out of nowhere, we wouldn't have the context to get it. Now, after all these things I've said, we can really start to get what an invariant would be, what it means, what Gibson meant it to be. Like some Native Americans say, we breathe life into our own words. Someone else does not. If we want to know what invariant means, we need to look at the life that Gibson breathed into it. If we need to know what an affordance means when we're reading Gibson, we need to know what life Gibson breathed into it. We should not take invariant or affordance and dress it up to be something we want and lead it about on a chain and make fun of it and say it's wrong. You know, we have no business doing that. They're not ours to chain and control. And we shouldn't get their words and think of them in our own minds as we think they are, and then try to think that we understand what they're saying. To understand what someone else is saying, we need to understand what they say. And again, so now that we've discussed what understanding is, we can have a better idea. Instead of getting the word invariant and trying to find something associated in our head to say that's what the person means, you know, that's a start, what we have, but that's only a very teeny tiny beginning. Or affordance, we might think, what the hell? Afford? Like you can afford something, you're using affordances? That makes no sense. But then it can help us understand what the other person means. You know, we need to understand what's the essence of a thing. Can we trace the idea back to reality? Where in reality did Gibson get the idea of invariant? You got this abstract idea, you got evidence of the senses, you look at a dog, you taste a hamburger, and you got concepts built up on concepts, generalization built up on generalization, until you get to invariant, or until you get to affordance. So what context and what real things and what reasoning in between leads to affordance? What real things, what concepts, what reasoning, what connecting of ideas leads to invariance? Then we'll understand. But as I say, now that we've gone through all that stuff, we can start to understand what they mean instead of trying to impose some meaning on our own. So invariance, we discussed a little bit already, and affordances. Now here's another thing that can be instructive. And again, I'll put links to some of this stuff in the description field so you can look at this on your own. Do your own research, do your own thinking, move through the environment on your own, by your own thinking, by your own will, achieving your own goals, living your own awesome life. So here, this is a theory of direct visual perception. There's a 5 up there, so maybe this is from an article, or a book, chapter 5 maybe, a theory of direct visual perception by Gibson. In here, I'll read the summary and conclusion, but at the beginning here, he says, quote, the theory to be outlined, you know, the theory of direct visual perception. The theory to be outlined is partly developed in The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, Gibson, 1966, especially in chapters 9 through 12 on vision. It is related to, although a considerable departure from, the theory presented in The Perception of the Visual World, Gibson, 1950. Some of its postulates go back 20 years to that book, but many are new. What is direct visual perception? I argue that the seeing of an environment by an observer existing in that environment is direct in that it is not mediated by visual sensations or sense data, unquote. So, again, we see the world. We're aware of the world. We're not merely aware of an image on our eye or some image in our brain. We see the world directly. We do not merely watch a movie screen that we think is telling us about what's in the world. Quote, the phenomenal visual world of surfaces, objects, and the ground under one's feet is quite different from the phenomenal visual field of color patches. Gibson, 1950, chapter 3. I assert that the latter experience, the array of visual sensations, is not entailed in the former. Direct perception is not based on the having of sensations. The suggestion will be that it is based on the pickup of information, unquote. So, scroll down to the summary in this article or chapter or whatever it is. Scroll a little bit more. Okay, here we go. Summary and conclusions. The theory of vision asserts that perception is direct and is not mediated by retinal images transmitted to the brain. Most theories assume that perception of the world is indirect and that all we ever directly perceive is our retinal images. Now, it is perfectly true that when an observer looks at a painting, photograph, sculpture, or model, he gets an indirect visual perception, a mediated experience, an awareness at second hand of whatever is represented, unquote. Because, the painting or the photograph is not the thing. The photograph is a representation of the thing. Quote, a human artifact of this sort is an image in the original meaning of the term. It is a light-reflecting object in its own right, but it displays information to specify a quite different object. Gibson, 1966, chapter 11, unquote. Like a picture displays information about some natural scenery or a mountain range or a hummingbird amidst some spruce trees. Quote, an image in the straightforward meaning of the term is something to be looked at, and it has to be looked at, of course, with eyes. Thus, there can be a direct perception of a man's portrait accompanied by an indirect perception of the man himself. The fallacy of the standard theories of perception consists of taking as a model for vision the kind of indirect visual perception that uses pictures as substitutes for things, unquote. So he's saying that most theories, like the fallacy of a lot of theories, is that they look at our vision as like us looking at pictures. As I say, it's like looking at a movie screen instead of the real thing. Quote, the false analogy should now be evident. Direct perception of a retinal image implies an eye inside the head, in the brain, with which to look at the image, unquote. So in other words, there'd have to be an eye to look at the image on the eye, right? Quote, but there is no little man anywhere in the brain who can do this. We do not look at our retinal images and perceive the world in the way that we look at a portrait and perceive the sitter. Putting the objection another way, the so-called image on the retina is not an image at all, properly speaking, since it cannot be looked at, as a picture can be looked at, and cannot therefore mediate perception. The famous experiment of looking at the back of the excised eye of a slaughtered ox and observing an image is profoundly misleading. The eye is a biological device for sampling the information available in an ambient optic array, unquote. I'll read it again. The eye is a biological device for sampling the information available in an ambient optic array, unquote, in our environment. It's a device for getting information about the real world. Quote, the vertebrate eye does it in one way and the insect eye does it in another way, but both register differences of light in different direction at a point of observation. The availability of information in ambient light and the possibility that it can be picked up directly have implications for epistemology. They lend sophisticated support to the so-called naive belief that we have direct knowledge of the world around us. They support direct realism, Gibson, 1967. If these hypotheses prove correct, they justify our deep feeling that the senses can be trusted, unquote. And again, notice he's saying that's science. What we know about studying things is science, but it can, unless we grasp philosophically pre-science that we have direct awareness and it's valid and the senses can be trusted, you cannot go on to do these things. You cannot study it scientifically. If you don't know what truth is in the first place, you can't do any science. You don't magically start knowing what truth is once you do science. That's like ludicrous. Or, you know, it's like, does the dog know that something's like real? Or, you know, but do they not know it because they don't have science? Or does the kid not know it? Like, does some kid have to learn what science is and then all of a sudden they, oh, whoa, like, all of a sudden they, like, become some different being or something and they, like, magically know what's true all of a sudden? Of course not. You know, it's ludicrous. We come to know and trust some things that we're taught are scientific only because of our prior experience with what is real and what is true. And so that's what's going on here. He's talking about science and epistemology. What people have learned in science is consistent with the proper epistemology. So, quote, I'll read it again, quote, if these hypotheses prove correct, unquote. And again, he's being scientific. He's not being like Descartes and trying to prescribe and dictate to the world what it's like. Or like Kant, like Immanuel Kant tried to say that Euclidean geometry was true, and that's the only thing there was, and we had necessarily to perceive space in terms of it, but he's wrong. There are other types of geometry. Descartes had some silly ideas too, but Gibson is being scientific here. If these hypotheses prove correct, notice it's a conditional statement. He says, he's implying what's the meaning there. The meaning there is they might not be. The meaning is we need more information. The meaning is we need to research this. The meaning is we have some evidence and reasoning to back it up so far. So, quote, if these hypotheses prove correct, they justify our deep feeling that the senses can be trusted. At the same time, they explain the seemingly contrary conviction that the senses cannot be trusted. For a distinction has to be drawn between what might be called the useful senses, the perceptual systems, and the useless senses, the channels of sensation, unquote. And then he leaves us with this little quandary and puzzle at the end. So, that's the end of that article, or whatever. Now, I've discussed invariance a little bit, so we got that idea down some. And affordances, that's a technical concept in the ecological approach to perception and movement, which is more broad and general and abstract than just the ecological approach to training, or to be even more specific, the ecological approach to training BJJ. So one more thing. So you get the affordance thing a little bit more. You see him speaking for himself, and you know I'm not speaking for him. So here we have section 8 of the chapter 8 of the ecological approach to visual perception. And this says printed in 1979, whereas the other one, the ecological approach to visual perception, did they get their date wrong? Or was this just a different printing of it? Because earlier, this one said 1986. The long excerpt I read earlier, but the thing I'm looking at now says 1979. Interesting. But chapter 8 of that book, a chapter called Affordances. So here, quote, I have described the environment as the surfaces that separate substances from the medium in which the animals live, unquote. So of course the environment, you got surfaces of a tree, surfaces of a plant, surfaces of a baseball bat, surfaces of a baseball, surfaces of a gi, surfaces of your hand, surfaces of a mat you're training BJJ on. These surfaces separate substances from the medium in which the animals live. So one temporary environment could be a studio where you're training BJJ and the animals in it are all human. So again, quote, I have described the environment as the surfaces that separate substances from the medium in which the animals live. But I have also described what the environment affords animals, mentioning the terrain, shelters, water, fire, objects, other animals, and human displays. How do we go from surfaces to affordances? And if there is information in light for the perception of surfaces, is there information for the perception of what they afford? Perhaps the composition and layout of surfaces constitute what they afford, unquote. Remember, we'll talk about what afford means in a second, but he's using that concept right now. So we'll get to it. And then you can go back and reread some of this on your own. Quote, if so, to perceive them is to perceive what they afford. This is a radical hypothesis, for it implies that the values and meanings of things in the environment can be directly perceived. Moreover, it would explain the sense in which values and meanings are external to the perceiver. The affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes either for good or ill. The verb to afford is found in the dictionary, but the noun affordance is not. I have made it up, unquote. And that's how science works. You coin words, or you get a word or concept and refine it for a scientific context. Okay. So there's this need he has to identify some item of knowledge in his studies. He needs this concept. And so to identify the concept, he's using the word affordance. Quote, I mean by it something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way no existing term does. I'll read that again, unquote. So, quote, I mean by it, affordance, something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. The antecedents of the term and the history of the concept will be treated later. For the present, let us consider examples of an affordance. Unquote. So notice it's an abstract concept that doesn't really identify something in the world like us perceiving it. It identifies something in the world, obviously, but it identifies an animal and the environment and the relationship between the two. Affordance considers and presupposes the concept of value, the concept of animal, the concept of motion, because affordance is a thing in the environment that an animal can use for to achieve a certain goal. It's got both of them in mind. It's not about the environment only, but the animal only, but how the animal relates to the environment. So, as some people have said, you can think about a stair, one step in a stairway to a small child, or a cat, or a small dog, or a squirrel. There's an affordance there. There's an affordance of sleeping. It's a surface they could rest on. Whereas for us, we're too big, and that step does not offer any affordance for sleeping. So notice it's a relationship between an individual animal and the environment. And I'd imagine you could use the term in different ways. Affordance for a species, as long as you identify it. But then affordance is more about an animal and its goals. And it can, as they point out, it can change depending on your needs and so on. Sometimes, and it does, because if you're hurt, so if you're normal, if you're healthy, you move around, a stairway affords or offers an affordance for you to move from one floor to another. It helps you change location, locomote, move around. But if you're hurt in some ways, it doesn't afford that anymore. Same person, different situation. Your leg's broken, something like that. For some reason, you can't use a stairway, so that affordance is not there. Or even maybe from one situation to another. Sometimes something can, let me see. Yeah, like if you're tired, yeah, not just hurt, but sometimes you kind of experience something in a different way. Maybe you could still walk up the stairway, but you've just exercised hard, you've worn out, maybe you got that thing we know about where if you do, some people you do leg day and your legs are just shot, it's like, man, today I'm not walking up the stairs. My legs are fried. Some days you could run up. The stairs afford locomotion. They afford moving from one place to another. A man on a leg day, they just don't. Or it could be that same day, You went up the stairs, you go to the gym, you work out your legs, and then it's like, man, you're taking the elevator or something like that. So that's how it shows how it helps you see the relationship between an animal and the environment. That's affordance. Or as he says here, quote, if a terrestrial surface, unquote, terrestrial, like on the earth, if a terrestrial surface is nearly horizontal instead of slanted, nearly flat instead of convex or concave, and sufficiently extended relative to the size of the animal, and if its substance is rigid relative to the weight of the animal, then the surface affords support. It is a surface of support, and we call it a substratum, ground or floor. It is stand-onable, permitting an upright posture for quadrupeds and bipeds. It is therefore walk-onable and run-overable. It is not sink-into-able like a surface of water or a swamp. That is not for heavy terrestrial animals. Support for water bugs is different, unquote. So there it helps you see an important concept in the ecological approach. And we're learning about what it really is and what it means. There again, there's a hell ton more there than just figuring it out yourself. A coach is going to see what you need to do. What is going to look at a coach will look at the relationship between an environment and an animal, an individual human, to see what will allow them to accomplish some goal. You got to look at the affordances, which are different for different people. But we'll talk about that more in the next part. Looking at briefly some ecological approach, specifically in the context of training and BJJ. But again, remember, like the ecological approach is about learning what to perceive to get something done and to accomplish some goal in the environment, a specific environment.